This is Avani from Hedgecraft Heirlooms, and you can see by my absolutely terrible, ridiculous makeup and outfit that today we are doing our 20th century witchcraft journey through the 1980s today, in case this blue and pink eyeshadow wasn't clear enough about what decade we're going to be doing today. So this was kind of fun to put together today. It's a little bit different. Hey June Job, we're here talking about a journey through the 1980s today. If you couldn't tell by my makeup, it's ridiculous. And I swear there we go. I just had like a weird thing happen. Anyway, so while we wait for folks to show up, I apologize if you are in advance to any of my Facebook folks. I was having a really hard time for some reason getting this video to start on Facebook. I tried in not Internet Explorer, that's not what it's called anymore, but Microsoft Edge, which is the browser that comes native with my device. I also tried Chrome, which usually does it. Even that wasn't working. I don't know what was going on. So I apologize if you're a Facebook person and you're watching this after the fact and you didn't get to catch it live. Hopefully you came over to Instagram to see what was going on. But that said, if you're here on Instagram and you're here live, I'm super glad to see you. So while we're in our pre-show here, while we wait for folks to show up, I like to do a little like bonus extra info that kind of is related to, but a little bit different from the main topic we're covering today. So like I said, the main topic today is journey through the 1980s, part of my 20th century witchcraft series, which sort of explores the ways that popular culture and the Wiccan and pagan community have evolved and influenced each other over the course of the 20th century. And one of the big things that happened in that century that it relates to the Wiccan pagan community, but they're not directly correlating, is the goth movement. So obviously if you are identify or ever identified as goth, you probably know that there's a lot of overlap between the goth community and the pagan Wiccan community, especially in the 90s. A little bit today, but I think it's almost, it depends on who it is, but it doesn't matter. The point is the goth movement is what we're going to talk about today in our little pre-show here. I thought we'd talk a little bit about the evolution of it, but the reason why we're including it in the 1980s is because a lot of the bulk of the goth movement as we know it today started in the 1980s. So goth subculture itself started as a kind of offshoot of the post-punk music genre. It was kind of considered to be a little bit less, I guess, aggressive. And that started in actually the late 1970s. And we're talking in the UK. So in America, it took a little bit longer for it to come over the pond. But that was the very kind of seed of it happening. And in the beginning of the 1980s, one band jokingly labeled the new movement, which up until this point didn't exactly have a name, as gothic. And so it changed from a label for a few bands that were kind of using it as a way for fans to identify them, and became a label for an entire movement. And in general, punk was considered like an aggressive rock, where goth bands were a little bit more kind of introverted, personal. I kind of made a little note for myself, emo, ? Which was not terminology that they were using back then, but compared to punk music, it was a little bit more emo by comparison. And of course, the subculture began out of a dissatisfaction within the youth of the time, as a way for them to kind of create their own culture that to them was sort of the opposite of what was the mainstream, which by their estimation was ruled by materialism and elitism. Hey there, me and we. As you can see, we're talking about the 1980s today. Hope you like my totally tubular, ridiculous 80s makeup today. Thankfully 80s makeup is kind of messy, so I didn't have to put too much time into it because this afternoon has been a whirlwind. But goth as a subculture is, much in the way I feel that the pagan Wiccan community is, for the most part, is not prejudiced towards sexuality, race, religion, or age. For that reason, a lot of people actually sort of compare it to the hippie movement, obviously with a very different aesthetic. It's commonly known that goths stand out, because of their kind of dark fashion, their dark style. But there was literally a study done, and it's kind of silly that they had to do this, but there was a study done by Sussex University, presumably in the 80s, that basically was intended to allay the fears of parents that if their child started dressing that way, they should not be worried. Mia Boy says, hello, I'm loving the 80s makeup, and yes, I remember it being like that. All you're missing is a slash of red on the lips. I do have, this is actually pink. This is lipstick. I never wear lipstick. I bought special for today. And I did pink instead of red because the outfit is very pink. And I don't know, like I remember like me being like a little kid, like putting on makeup. I was all about the pink, like, you know, like the pink and the blue and the pink. So this is sort of a little bit of a nostalgia as far as like as a little kid how I perceived the 80s. So that's why I went with pink instead of red lipstick. But absolutely, the red would be very Madonna, which the eye makeup was very much inspired by. But anyway, on the contrary, compared to this very ridiculous and the sort of silly study done by the Sussex University, they were telling parents that actually if their child was trying to dress the way that they should be happy and excited for them, because they were generally considered to be very middle class and very refined, sensitive group that was keen on old literature and not big on antisocial behavior. I mean, obviously goth clubs are a really big thing. So they were a very social bunch, or are a very social bunch, I should say. In the mid-1980s, a lot of those post-punk bands that originally inspired the goth movement kind of faded away, and punk kind of became a little bit less popular, or kind of went underground. And during that time, a lot of the gothic bands, or bands that had identified as goth during that period, kind of broke up or came to the resolution of changing their style away from that sort of genre. And even though the punk kind of aesthetic mellowed, the original idea of them being like the rejects of society kind of remained as the cornerstone of the punk goth subculture. And of course today the goth style is in a lot of ways sort of like an anti-fashion movement, even, you know, still sort of again like the anti-fashion, you know, like where we have lots of color, you know, their ideas keep it very dark, very black, very mellow. And in spite of the fact that it was originally intended to be sort of like the anti-fashion, the anti-culture, the anti-whatever, it's ironically become very popular in some ways. And even mainstream, and even Hollywood, like that, and I've never watched it, but even that character Abby from like, was that NCIS or whatever, you know, who's sort of goth, or certainly moving, and we'll talk about this more when the time comes, but certainly moving into the kind of renaissance of the witch that happened in the 90s with pop media and the movies and television. You saw a lot of that aesthetic there. So that is our little pre-show about the evolution of the goth movement. So that said, let's actually talk about what y'all came here for, and that is a journey through the 1980s, part of my 20th century witchcraft series. Hey, I'm just gonna say Littlefoot because I don't want to mess up the rest of your name, but we're glad you're here. We're just about to jump in, so you have perfect timing. So let's start by talking a little bit about the historical and cultural events that were taking place in the 80s. And just real quick as a refresher, because I can't quite remember when people jumped in, this entire series is intended to be a way to kind of go back and observe and remember all the things that happened in popular culture during the whatever decade we're talking about that kind of led to bringing the Wiccan pagan witchcraft community to where it is today. So that's history, that's culture, that's media, that's literature. So there's lots of things that I like to talk about in these videos that I think are really fascinating that kind of brought us to where we are today. But let's start with the history and culture of the 1980s. So I just talked about the whole goth movement, so that was a really big thing, of course. And I mentioned it, or I thought it was a relevant detail or aspect to talk about in our pre-show, because one of the things that I feel the punk goth movements have in common with the Wiccan pagan witchcraft community even today is that it is oftentimes characterized as being something of an anti-culture, an anti-something. In this case, almost anti-Christian, if we're talking about religion and spirituality. Within the punk goth movement, Christianity was part of the normal that they were trying to buck, that they were trying to get away from. So then things like Satanism and witchcraft and paganism kind of became the opposite in a way, or was perceived in that way, and which is why there is a lot of overlap. And of course, other than that, in 1983, a very important thing happened that would most certainly not allow us to be here talking about this in this exact way today, and that is that the internet was born in 1983. So the World Wide Web, so the internet was born, and originally, if you don't already know this thing, the internet was actually used as a networking system within this particular, actually within the a government, I believe, possibly even the United States government. I don't have my exact details 100% down in my memory, but it was originally intended to be used, within certain companies and organizations, but it wasn't until 1989 that the World Wide Web, as we use it today, was created. So, of course, we'll talk about that a lot more in the 90s, at length, I am sure. So, another thing that happened in the 80s is Sally Ride became the first woman in space. To me, any feminist event kind of falls under the blanket of pagan, Wiccan, 20th century witchcraft info. Anything that involves the empowerment of women, I think, is relevant to the development of female empowerment as we find it within, Wicca and witchcraft as well. And then another thing that, I've talked about this a bunch in previous decades, but in the 1980s, something called the Satanic Panic really came into full swing. So if you're not familiar with the concept of the Satanic Panic or if you've missed my videos previously, it was a widespread preoccupation of certain American, typically conservative groups in the 1980s and 90s with allegations of satanic ritual abuse in various settings. Specifically, hey Freedom, we're talking about the 1980s today if you couldn't tell. Specifically within media. So we're talking about in music, the goths or the punks, in movies, television, and even some gaming things that were going on. In great examples would be Dungeons and Dragons. And it's funny that I came across that in my research because I have distinct memories as a child so my stepfather actually, is 7 years younger than my mom. Or was. They're not married anymore. But that's, yes, Freedom says he lived through the 80s. I did know that thing. Huge Prince fan. I remember. So, where was I? Oh, as a kid, I can remember that, so my dad, younger than my mom, he was super into Dungeons and Dragons before they met. And my mom had kind of newly come into religion and, being reborn, so to speak. And she kind of shamed him, I guess, guilted him out of playing D&D anymore because in her mind, again, part of the Satanic Panic, so this is more 90s and 80s, but basically convinced him that it was evil and that he shouldn't play it anymore. Another thing that I can remember that being true with Magic the Gathering, which was in the 90s, but the Satanic Panic was very real, very, very, and if Freedom lived through the 80s, I'm sure that he has memories like that too. Some other things that fell under scrutiny, of course, witchcraft, duh. I think Lord of the Rings might have, Lord of the Rings certainly was subject to it too, although I think that came out in the 70s or 60s, because I remember speaking about that previously. But just as another example, so anything that was in, we asked, did my dad ever get back into D&D? He did not. But him and my ex-husband are sort of like the same person, and my ex-husband's really into D&D. Does that count? No, he never got back into it. They, Freedom says, it is evil, it drains your bank account. So, where was I? D&D, but you ever get back into it? No. They stayed together until I was 20, I think. And by that point, they had had another kid, and he was just super busy. At that point in time, he got into other hobbies, beer collecting. So not just drinking it, but collecting it and throwing it into spreadsheets. But that's a whole other story. So no, he never did get back into it. I think that, and again, we're getting really deep into my personal life, but I think that part of it was that he was kind of obsessive about it. So I think, in a way, my mom demonizing D&D became, it was in part about trying to just get his attention away from something that she felt like was not great for their relationship, in a way that made her not the bad guy, if that makes any sense. But anyway, like I said, he replaced some other things later on, and it ended up not being great for the relationship anyway, but I digress. So, the reason why witchcraft, of course, is often kind of lumped into this whole satanic panic thing, anything magic actually related or fantasy within the fantasy genre kind of gets lumped together in there. But certainly witchcraft is frequently, and if you are a witch or you're pagan, obviously you probably don't need me to tell you this, but I like to kind of mention this, talk about this as if there's someone here who doesn't know this, or doesn't know the basics. That witchcraft is often wrongly conflated with Satanism. Mia Bui says, my husband's grandmother was convinced my witchy ass was leading him down the road to hell. I gotcha. Yeah. Yeah. Again, way deep into my personal life. So my ex's father's side of his family was extremely religious. And I kind of kept it under wraps for a long time that I was not normal, I guess we'll say. And it kind of came to light in the few months leading up to our actual wedding, and there were family members of his, including his own father, who basically decided not to come to our wedding because I was pagan. So I was really traumatized by that for a while, and I think that they all were probably totally praying for me to just kind of go away, which I guess technically did work eventually. But he is still super not Christian, so if that was their goal, then they missed out on that one. We says, yeah, sometimes you have to keep things close to the vest to keep the peace. I just got to a point, basically what it was is that my wedding, even my first wedding, was sort of a traditional, like a hybrid between a traditional wedding and a hand fasting. So we wore all the traditional clothing and we had an officiant, but the ceremony itself was not very traditional. And it was, but it was subtle. So afterwards people came up to us and they'd be like, whoa, that was really cool. That was different. I liked it, but they couldn't have possibly pinpointed how or why, because we weren't being, overt about it. But there was at least one person, very, very distant family, who sat at her table after the wedding and was like, that was pagan, to my mother. It was a distant relative of hers who was very offended. But obviously I'm here. It didn't have any effect on me whatsoever. But my second wedding was just over the top pagan almost. It was fantasy themed. People were in costume. It was super fun. So totally different vibe. But anyway, away from me, back to the 1980s. So witchcraft, wrongly conflated with Satanism. So of course satanic witches do exist. But they are definitely not the majority. And a lot of times, and again, we're kind of doing a little bit of a tangent here, but Satanism, satanic witchcraft, is often not literally working with Satan. Oftentimes it's, and I might be getting my terminology wrong, but it's used as an allegory for, again, kind of anti-religion or anti-theism. And sort of favoring, the physical over the spiritual, not necessarily Satan or Lucifer as a being or a deity. And of course, those people also exist. But my point is that's a very small, wedge of the pie chart of pagan folk out there. But the point is that when Wicca paganism is kind of lumped into Satanism, it's not really accurate. Certainly not in the way that it's perceived by the majority of the population. And as a result, witchcraft and witches basically became a scapegoat for all things bad. And it even became a way to kind of, and of course the Satanic Panic wasn't just rumor. There were a lot of occult killings that took place in these decades, where they would find pentagrams carved into people's bodies, or upside down crosses, or they'd be in circles on the ground, or crazy things where people were like, what, witches? And so that's kind of how the Satanic Panic happened. But it was really, really big in the 1980s. In spite of that, of course, there was a lot happening in pop culture with witches as well, which we'll get to in just a second. Some notable figures and publications that came out in the 1980s. Scott Cunningham published most of his books in the 1980s, and if you lived through the 80s, and you're about my age, you probably know who that is. But let's assume that for ha-has that there's probably somebody out there watching this at some point who's probably a little bit younger than that and might have not actually heard of him before. Scott Cunningham is pretty much the basics for beginner Wicca author, and he has so many books that cover so many topics, and he is a wonderful author to read if you're starting out or you're newly into Wicca and paganism as a whole. I recommend him to everybody who's like, ooh, what books do you recommend? I'm like, Scott Cunningham. Because he lays it out and it's really simple. And if you're unfamiliar with the kind of structure of things, it kind of, I don't know, it just really simplifies things. And his most popular book, again, that one that I usually recommend to people, is called Wicca, A Guide for the Solitary Practitioner. Another big book, a big book, haha, I feel like that's actually kind of a joke, but book was Buckland's Complete Book of Witchcraft, which is funny because it's literally a big book. I kind of affectionately refer to it as Bucky's Big Blue Book. Meeply says, so glad I'm not the only one that recommends him as a starting point. Absolutely not. He's wonderful. Like, Buckland is okay. I find that he's very traditional. It feels actually kind of stuffy. It's very ritual. It's very ceremonial in a way, you know. And Buckland, again, I wrote about him back for the 60s, I believe. I think. Or maybe it was the 70s, I don't remember. It was recently, it was for one of these videos. But he practiced a really specific version of Wicca and witchcraft that had very particular rules about the way things were supposed to be done. So I think that Big Blue Book definitely does have some value in it. There's a lot of great information that you can kind of glean from it, but I definitely don't think you need to use it like a Bible. I don't think you should use any witchcraft book like a Bible, for the record. Even if it has the word Bible in the title. Your mileage may vary for all of these things. But those are some really big authors that were popular at the time, that were being published at the time. Mia Wee says, I know you mean, he's kind of formal and like half of everything is naked. Like, dude, yeah, so Ray Buckland was actually a nudist. It was a big part of his whole history. Hey, Sofa Couch, we're here talking about the 1980s. Again, kind of doing a little bit of a review, but Ray Buckland had a lot of issues with like asthma and respiratory issues even when he was young. And at some point, some crazy doctor said to him, oh, why don't you try being a nudist? Because that might help. I don't know where the logic was there, but the point is that he was like, yeah, all right, that sounds cool. I could try that. And from like that point forward, he was like naked for everything, like always naked. And I'm going to tell you, I've done naked rituals. I think that has a place and a value if you have the ability to have a space where you can do that. But I definitely don't think it needs to be the norm. Anyway, moving past Ray Buckland being a nudist, let's go back to talking about pop culture, because that's really where I feel like the 80s really shines for, you know, Wicca, paganism, witchcraft, and where we are today. So one of the cool things about, kind of like the most notable thing about all the witches that were depicted in the popular media in the 1980s is that there were a lot of different archetypes being presented in different movies and television shows. And if you're not familiar with the term archetype, an archetype is sort of like a character or a type of character that is so universal that everybody's familiar with it, and they have specific names, like the hero, like like that one seems obvious, but like the hero, the wizard, the child, the mother, you know. So and I actually talk about archetypes a lot when I teach tarot. But that was just to give you an idea of what an archetype is. But there were a lot of archetypes within the witch that were being explored in popular media at the time. We had she was called the Witch in Conan the Barbarian, which I didn't watch, so don't try to ask me questions about it. I just found this on the internet. If you did, cool, feel free to chime in. But the witch in Conan the Barbarian, she was something of a seductress. So we had the kind of like the sexy witch happening, which is relevant because, the loose or the sexy or the promiscuous woman is definitely an archetype that we find in lots of different places, but also being associated with being a witch. And I think that, and that's a whole conversation about feminism and kind of equating evil with witchcraft, evil with promiscuity, and evil with liking to have fun. But again, neither here nor there. Some other ones we had Ursula the Sea Witch, again, kind of a villain, so we have the kind of evil connection, but she was self-serving. I kind of made a little note for myself here that she sort of like the under the water, under the sea version of Baba Yaga. She was an old woman, and when people wandered into her home, she kind of would lure them in with promises of all these things that were for them, but were really for her. If we says, well, yeah, they can't have us women doing sexy things. No, they can't, but they also desperately want us to. So, there's no right answer. But anyway. Of course, we also had The Witches of Eastwick, which is a wonderful movie if you've never seen it, which was very empowering. So that was actually approaching the witches from the archetype of the powerful woman. And then we had Elvira, so we still have sexy, but also goth and a little bit camp, and she was kind of funny. And then we had Teen Witch, which if you're on Instagram or if you're on Facebook, saw one of the movie posters for Teen Witch was the image for this live stream here today. But the Teen Witch, she was kind of the progenitor origin of what we had in the 90s, which was Sabrina the Teenage Witch, which I know I watched a great part of. But I think that movie in particular kind of was what opened up that genre in the 1990s. Of course, we also had Kiki's Delivery Service, so we're talking about Ghibli Studios, which a lot of people are obsessed with today. Kiki's Delivery Service, it was very wholesome. There was idea of self-growth and serving the community, which is another actually archetype that we find for the witch, even in mythology, even we're going back to Baba Yaga. So Baba Yaga in various myths and stories is often either very helpful or very self-serving, and rarely both at the same time, interestingly. But again, we kind of get a little bit of both depending on which characters we're looking at. And then, of course, there were several horror films that had witches in them. We had Halloween 3, The Devonsville Terror, Inferno, and some other things. But witches were a hot ticket in the 1980s. So we got a lot of great characters, a lot of great archetypes that were explored, which was really great. So that's what we have kind of happening popular culture-wise. And now real quick, before we kind of wrap up, I want to talk a little bit about the popular motif decor designs that were taking place in the 80s. And this is especially for my thrift witches out there, because if you're ever out there thrifting and you're like, I wonder what decade this is from, because I feel like knowing this information from these live streams is nice, because you get a sense of the flavor and the energy of a decade in a piece, that comes from that decade. If it's the 40s, or if it's the 90s, or if it's the 40s, there's a lot, very different energy of things that were happening in the world at that time. So I think it's really interesting. So if you're looking for stuff and you're like, I love the 80s, I love the energy of the 80s, I want to find pieces from the 80s because I want to bring that energy into my space, this is what to look for. Obviously, big, bold designs. Very colorful, almost painfully so. Neon was really big. There was actually a sort of half of a joke. They often refer to it as neon noir. We have a lot of neon colors. You can see I kind of tapped into pink today. I got my crazy pink chunky jewelry. These aren't exactly neon, but colorful. And very bold patterns, big bold patterns, not just bold, big. And oftentimes those patterns are very kind of geometrical, which you can see this is geometric patterns, triangles. Another thing that you saw a lot was tropical motifs. That's why I grabbed these sunglasses, which actually belong to my 6-year-old. True story. Tropical motifs, so you saw a lot of things with palm trees and beaches and suns. So you get the sun that has the lines through it, very 80s. It was also during that time period, and I didn't go too far into this, and I'm definitely not an expert, but the popularization of urban Black-inspired culture kind of started in the 80s as well. Futuristic-inspired design, so there's a lot of metallics, a lot of sci-fi-inspired imagery. You got those, the grids. I always think of, Tron, where you had, the grids where it was, you're in virtual reality, which, of course, it's nothing what virtual reality actually looks like. Things like that. And then, of course, 80s Deco, which was sort of a riff on the Art Deco movement, which was back in the 20s and 30s. So it's sort of geometric again, and similar to Art Deco. And actually, I have a great example. This is actually a piece that's going to be in my live sale here momentarily, but this is sort of very 80s Deco, where it's reminiscent of Art Deco, but it's got a distinctly 80s flavor. That's why I grabbed this piece, because it felt very 80s to me. And then as far as fashion is concerned, of course, we have the punk and gothic aesthetics. Mia Hui says that makes me think of the Lawnmower Man's VR. Oh, you're talking about the grids? There's a little bit of a delay between your comments and when I say things, so let me know what you're referring to so I can know what page we're on here. So I'm feeling a little behind. Hey Dan, we were just talking about the 1980s. I know you desperately want to make a comment about my hair and makeup today, so feel free. No Dan, I'm not inviting you. You're not going to be added to the video, but I'm glad that you're here watching. So let's see. So yeah, punk, goth aesthetic. Big was black lace, black leather, of course. So of course also oversized blazers and sweaters, which are kind of in right now. Actually, like this is actually a really stylish kind of shirt right now too, which is kind of why I wasn't upset about grabbing it. Meebly says, dang, I've got to drag too. Oh, it's normal. There's always a delay between what I say and when you type your comments. It's always been that way. So like there's always, and I've never tried to count it, but like there's a good like 5 to 10 second delay. Jan says, LAO, I don't know how the video thing works. I've never added anyone to my video, so I don't know exactly how it works either, but I think it would make it like a split screen so people could see both of us on screen at the same time. Bright chunky accessories. Can you hear that? Bright chunky accessories. I remember being obsessed with bangle bracelets when I was a little kid. Dan was just about to say 90s and late 80s is in. It's super in right now, which is why my hair and my style didn't exactly make this video a stretch. Time to get me a denim jacket. I had one. I gave it to someone because I couldn't figure out how to style it. But I do have a full denim jumpsuit. I have a denim maxi skirt currently. And of course right now, because I'm really like thinking about like fall and autumn fashion right now, I've been buying jeans. So they're so denim that I wear as actual jeans, so that too. We says, oh my god, demon. I think she meant denim, but wrote demon jackets, which is really funny, FYI. Of course, also patchwork became really popular in the 80s. And finally, acid wash jeans. Dan says that he has a bleached Guess one. I assume denim jacket. I'm wearing jeans today. This is the lightest wash I could find at the thrift that actually fit me. I bought it special for today, just for you guys. So striped tube tops. Maybe? I'd have to Google that. I feel like I associate tube tops more with like this, probably late, but like the 70s. But yeah, maybe. So anyway, that's what I have about the 1980s. You guys have been like super fun. I love when people talk a lot and give me a lot of comments and we get to have a conversation because it's way more fun that way. Usually what happens now is I'm going to do a little bit of a live sale. But before I do that, I'm going to do a sign off. Now, if you're here and you want to watch the live sale, don't actually go anywhere yet because I am going to keep going. I'm just doing this sign off, so when I go to upload this to my YouTube later, I know where to cut it off. So if you're here watching on YouTube, thank you so much for joining me. This is my second to last installment of this 20th Century Witchcraft series. I do have plans in the near future to start doing fewer of these live streams, to know of these live streams, and kind of diving into doing Reels and TikToks a lot more because the algorithm right now is really favoring those more than the live videos like this at this point. However, for the last, now that I'm thinking about it, when I do that, I will be doing the 1990s. I will do that as a live stream, I think, just because I wanna feel like I'm wrapping up this series the way I started it. So that will happen too. But anyway, thank you so much for joining. I'm so glad you could be here. I hope that you enjoyed our journey through the 1980s, and I hope that you have a wonderful week. Until next time. Next week, the theme is going to be the Hedge Witch. Very excited about that, sort of the namesake of Hedgecraft Heirlooms. And we're going to be talking about the power of a ritual trance in next week's live video, which will be the last one that I have officially scheduled. So that said, thanks for being here. Hope you have a great weekend. Take care. Blessed be. See you next time. I'm going to do this